Welcome, dear listener, to the Candlelight Historian. Settle in, let the quiet of the evening embrace you as we embark on a new journey together, a series that will carry us through one of history's most shadowed epochs. We begin tonight by illuminating a year etched in the annals of human experience as one of singular, almost unimaginable hardship. 536 AD, often grimly dubbed the worst year to be alive. It was a time when the very sky seemed to turn against humanity, when a mysterious dimming of the sun cast a long, cold, and terrifying pall over vast swathes of the known world. In this series, we will travel across continents, from the windswept fjords of Scandinavia to the arid plains of Peru, from the bustling cities of the Byzantine Empire to the distant rice paddies of China. We will seek out not the grand pronouncements of emperors or the strategies of generals, but the quiet, often unrecorded lives of ordinary people. The farmers, the artisans, the herders, the healers, as they navigated this global crisis. How did they cope? What did they believe? How did they endure when the world they knew was fundamentally, frighteningly altered? Tonight, our flickering flame takes us to the Emerald Isle, to early medieval Ireland, a land of mist-shrouded hills, petty kingdoms, strong kinship ties, and ancient, deeply held beliefs. Here, in a small homestead, a roundhouse nestled perhaps in a gentle valley or by the edge of a whispering wood, we find Aoife, a farmer, his wife Líadan, and their three young children, Ronan, Fia, and little Cale. Their world, already one of hard toil and simple means, is about to be irrevocably changed by the unfolding global calamity. Join us as we step softly into their lives to witness not just their struggles, but their resilience, their quiet acts of coping, and the enduring human spirit that flickers even in the deepest darkness. This is their story, a whisper from a dimmed Irish homestead in the year the sun lost its strength. Part 1, The Unraveling Sky. The year had turned as all years do, with the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts of winter yielding to the hesitant promise of spring. Aoife, a man whose life was as intimately tethered to the rhythms of the land as the roots of the ancient oaks were to the soil, had felt the familiar quickening in his bones, the deep-seated urge to prepare the earth for the barley and oats that would, with the gods' favor, feed his family through another cycle of seasons. He was a man of sturdy build, his shoulders broad from the heft of the ard plow and the swing of the axe, his hands calloused and ingrained with the earth he worked. His face, often turned towards the heavens, was weathered by wind and sun, though the sun of late had become a reluctant and unsettlingly weak companion. He'd always found a certain solace in the predictability of the seasons, the unwavering return of warmth and light. Now, that solace was being eroded, replaced by a creeping, formless anxiety. It began subtly, insidiously, not as a sudden cataclysm, but as a creeping alteration of the familiar, a lingering chill in the air that the strengthening spring mornings ought to have decisively chased away, a dampness that clung to his woolen tunic long after sunrise. A strange, persistent haze, like a thin gray veil, that clung to the distant hills and blurred the edges of the familiar landscape, even on days when no rain fell. Aoife would rise before the first true light, a habit ingrained since boyhood, stepping out from the smoky animal and human warmth of their circular, thatched roundhouse. He would stand for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, his brow furrowed in a deepening line of concern. The sun, when it finally and reluctantly appeared, seemed different, weaker, stripped of its customary vigor, its golden rays diluted to a pale, watery yellow. Procopius, a learned historian far away in the great city of Constantinople, would later write with a scholar's precision that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. Cassiodorus, a statesman in Italy, would echo these observations, speaking of a bluish sun, of a world where shadows, even at high noon, were faint and indistinct, as if the very essence of light had been diluted. Aoife, of course, had no knowledge of these distant scholarly observations, no understanding of the colossal volcanic eruptions that scientists now believe spewed vast quantities of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, creating this sun-obscuring veil. He only knew what his senses, honed by a lifetime of observing the subtle language of the natural world, told him. The air was colder than it should be. The light was thin, watery, and strange, and a deep, unspoken unease was settling over the land like the persistent mist itself. This dense, dry fog, as it would be described in chronicles across continents, was beginning to weave itself into the very fabric of their days, a constant, unsettling presence that would linger for what would become a harrowing 12 to 18 months for many across the northern hemisphere. The very air felt heavier, lacking the usual crispness of spring. Inside the roundhouse, Líadan would already be stirring, her movements economical and practiced in the dim light. She would be coaxing the central hearth fire, the very heart of their home, back to life from the glowing embers carefully banked the night before. The scent of peat smoke, earthy, pungent, and deeply familiar, would mingle with the ever-present dampness that seemed to seep in from the very soil beneath their feet, a dampness made more pervasive by the lack of strong sunlight to dry the land. Their home, like those of their neighbors in the Tuath, the small local territory, a petty kingdom ruled by their chieftain, or Ri, was a single, large circular space. Walls constructed of sturdy wooden posts, interwoven with flexible wattle and daubed with a thick layer of clay and dung, perhaps reinforced with a low stone foundation, rose to meet a conical roof, expertly thatched with reeds or straw harvested from nearby marshes or fields. There was no chimney as such. The smoke from the constantly smoldering peat fire found its way out slowly through the thatch itself or through the single low doorway, leaving a permanent glistening film on the rafters above and a lingering smoky scent in their hair, their woolen clothes, and on their very skin. Líadan often found herself coughing more, her eyes stinging from the trapped smoke in the poorly ventilated space, a discomfort amplified by the need to keep the fire burning higher against the unusual cold. Their 3 children, Ronan, Fia, and Little Seal, slept on simple pallets of straw or dried bracken, perhaps covered with animal hides, huddled together for warmth in a designated sleeping area within the roundhouse's curve. Ronan, the eldest at perhaps 10 summers, was already beginning to understand the weight of his father's concerns, his small hands increasingly eager to help with the tasks of the farm. He'd stopped asking so many questions about why the sun was hiding, sensing the gravity in his parents' silence. Fia, a bright-eyed, observant girl of 7, was Líadan's shadow, learning the myriad skills of managing a household. Her laughter, usually a bright, bubbling sound in the often dim interior, now noticeably more subdued. She'd taken to drawing patterns in the dust on the floor, small, fleeting creations in the gloom. Cale, barely 5, was the cherished youngest, his world still largely one of play and the comforting, encompassing presence of his mother, though even he seemed to sense the subtle shift in the household's mood, clinging more tightly to Líadan's skirts, his usual boisterousness tempered by a new, unchildlike quiet. Breakfast was a meager affair, more so now with the lingering cold affecting even the early growth of wild greens and the milk yield of their cow. A thin porridge of oats, perhaps, boiled with water or a little milk, or a piece of horse bread made from last year's precious grain, softened with a touch of soured milk. Líadan would look at her husband across the flickering firelight, her eyes the color of the deepest bog pools reflecting his own unspoken worries. She, too, had noticed the strangeness of the sky, the way the bird song seemed less vibrant, more hesitant, the way the new shoots in her small, carefully tended herb garden near the roundhouse struggled to uncurl, their growth stunted and pale. The familiar scent of damp earth was now tinged with a persistent chill that never quite left their clothes or bedding. "The sun hides its face again, Aoife," she might say, her voice low, almost a whisper, so as not to alarm the children unduly. It is as if Angrian herself is unwell or has turned her gaze from us. Aoife would nod slowly, his gaze distant, fixed on the swirling patterns of smoke rising towards the roof. "It does, Líadan. It does. The old ones, the storytellers, they spoke of winters that bit deep, of summers that were cool and wet. But this feels different, more profound, as if the world itself is holding its breath." He thought of the stories passed down through generations, tales of the Tuatha De Danann, the god-folk who were said to have come from the heavens and dwelt in the hidden mounds, the city, beings whose favor was crucial for the land's bounty and the turning of the seasons. Had they been offended by some transgression, some forgotten ritual? Or was this something else entirely? Something even the oldest tales, the deepest ancestral memories, did not account for. The moon on Gaelach, too, seemed to have lost its usual silvery luster when it appeared. Its phases, so crucial for planting and harvesting, now observed with a heightened sense of anxiety. The usual folklore about the moon's influence on crops and tides felt more like a desperate hope than a reliable guide. The children, acutely sensitive to the emotional currents within their small family unit, were often quieter too. Ronan would follow his father out into the pale, weak morning light, his small face mimicking Aoife's concerned frown as he too squinted at the watery, ineffective light that passed for sunrise. The world around their small enclosed farmstead, their rath, a circular earthen bank topped with a wooden palisade that offered some protection to their home and livestock, seemed muted, drained of its usual vibrancy. The brilliant greens of the Irish landscape, usually so intense after the spring rains, appeared duller, more subdued under the veiled sun. The air lacked the crisp clarity, the invigorating freshness of a true spring morning. Instead, it was heavy, still, and carried a persistent, bone-deep chill that promised little growth, little comfort. The very sensory experience of their world was changing, the familiar rapidly becoming alien, the predictable cycles of nature thrown into a state of profound, terrifying uncertainty. And this, they would come to understand with a slow, dawning horror, was only the beginning. The failure of bread, as the Irish annals would later starkly and laconically record for these devastating years, was yet to fully manifest its cruelest consequences, but its bitter seeds were being sown in the cold, unyielding earth under a sky that had seemingly forgotten its ancient strength and benevolence. Part 2. The Weight of the Land. The days that followed bled one into another, each marked by the same unsettling dimness, the same unseasonable, penetrating cold that gnawed at the edges of their resilience and frayed their hopes. For Aoife, the farmer, a man whose identity and sustenance were inextricably bound to the soil, the land itself became a source of growing, almost unbearable, despair. He toiled from the weak, gray dawn to the early, gloomy dusk. His ard plow, a simple, ancient wooden implement, perhaps tipped with a small, precious piece of iron to give it an edge against the more stubborn clods, struggling to break the cold, compacted earth. He and Ronan, his small shadow, sowed the precious barley and oat seeds, saved with such care and foresight from the previous year's modest harvest. They cast them onto the painstakingly prepared earth with the customary prayers, ancient words whispered to the spirits of the land, the Aosi who were believed to dwell in the rocks and streams, and to the sun, Angrian, that seemed to have forsaken them, its face hidden behind an impenetrable veil. Each seed felt like a gamble against impossible odds. But the sun remained a pale, indifferent disk in the hazy, often featureless sky. The European summer temperatures, as climatologists and historians now estimate from tree rings and ice core data, plummeted by as much as 1.5 to nearly 3 degrees Celsius below what was normal for the time. For crops like barley and oats, reliant on a certain measure of warmth and abundant sunlight to mature, this prolonged chill was a death knell. Aoife watched, his heart a heavy stone in his chest, as the seedlings that did manage to struggle forth from the cold earth were stunted, pale, and weak. The barley, which should have been forming plump, nodding heads full of grain, grew thin and sparse, its ears small and mostly empty. The oats, usually a hardier crop, also languished, their stalks lacking vigor, their panicles bearing few kernels. The vibrant, hopeful green he longed to see stretching across his small fields was replaced by a sickly, yellowish green, a visual testament to the failing light and the starving soil. The failure of bread, that stark, chilling entry in the monastic chronicles, was becoming Aoife's daily, agonizing, lived reality. There would be precious little grain to harvest in the autumn, little to grind with the heavy, laborious quernstones, little to sustain them through the inevitably harsh and hungry winter that loomed ahead. He would often stand at the edge of his fields, the damp wind whipping his hair, just staring, a profound sense of helplessness washing over him. Their few animals, the small herd that represented their wealth and a significant portion of their sustenance, suffered alongside them. The single milk cow, their main source of precious dairy, the fresh milk, the soured milk, the butter, and the simple, soft cheeses that were staples of their diet, grew thinner with each passing week. Her ribs began to show, her coat lost its sheen. The pasture land, like the cultivated fields, was poor and sparse, the grasses lacking richness, their growth stunted by the persistent cold and the lack of nourishing sunlight. Líadan, whose task it was to milk the cow each morning and evening, found the yield dwindling alarmingly. The warm, frothy milk that Teal so loved was becoming a rare treat, measured out in tiny portions. The sheep, whose wool was essential for their coarse, homespun clothing and whose meat was a vital reserve, huddled together for warmth against the unseasonable chill, their fleeces looking ragged and thin. They bleated more often, a mournful sound that echoed the family's own anxieties. Even the pigs, hardy and usually adept at foraging for roots, acorns, and grubs in the nearby woods and waste patches, found slim pickings as the entire ecosystem struggled under the oppressive atmospheric conditions. They grew lean and bad-tempered. Líadan bore her own considerable burdens with a quiet, unwavering strength, though her heart ached for her children and her husband. The roundhouse, their only sanctuary against the increasingly hostile world, felt damper than usual, the chill harder to keep at bay, despite the constant smoky peat fire that she tended with such care. Her days were a relentless, exhausting cycle of trying to make much from very little. She mended their woolen tunics and cloaks, the rough, lanolin-rich fabric often damp against their skin, patching and repatching until the original weave was obscured. She tended her small vegetable patch near the house, a patch that in better years would yield cabbages, onions, and perhaps some hardy root vegetables, coaxing what little life she could from the struggling plants. Her deep inherited knowledge of foraging, of the edible and medicinal plants of the hedgerows, woods, and bogs, became more critical than ever. With Fia, her small, increasingly adept assistant, by her side, she would spend countless hours searching the changed and impoverished landscape for anything that might supplement their dwindling stores. Tough, starchy roots that required long boiling to become palatable, the few hardy berries that dared to ripen in the gloom, bitter but edible greens, perhaps even certain types of nutritious seaweed if they lived near enough to the coast to make the journey worthwhile. Every handful gathered was a small, precious victory against the pervasive, gnawing hunger that was becoming their constant companion. She taught Fia to distinguish the safe from the poisonous with a new urgency, her voice low and serious. Food preservation, always a vital skill in a world without refrigeration, took on a desperate, almost sacred urgency. What little surplus they had, or what they could painstakingly forage, needed to last as long as humanly possible. Salting meat was a known and ancient practice, though meat itself was becoming an almost unimaginable luxury. If they were forced to slaughter a weakened animal, every scrap would be carefully preserved. Fermentation, another ancient art, might have been used for some vegetables, or to create soured milk products like clabber or simple cheeses that kept longer than fresh milk and were often more digestible. Pickling in brine, if they had access to precious salt and suitable pottery or wooden vessels, could extend the life of some foraged goods. But all these techniques required resources: salt, containers, fuel for boiling brine, that were themselves becoming scarce and valuable. Each decision about what to eat now versus what to try and save for the even leaner, colder times that were undoubtedly ahead was fraught with a heavy, unspoken anxiety. Líadan would often lie awake at night, the faces of her hungry children swimming in the darkness, calculating and recalculating their meager stores. The children, even young Seal, could not escape the oppressive atmosphere of scarcity and fear. Ronan, old enough now to fully understand the gravity of the failing crops and the thinning livestock, worked alongside his father with a somber diligence that belied his tender years. He might be tasked with the frustrating and largely futile effort of scaring away the desperate crows from the struggling grain, or helping to gather firewood or dried peat, which seemed to burn faster and faster in the constant biting chill. Fia, too, had her expanding roster of chores. Fetching water in a small wooden bucket from the nearby stream, a task that now seemed to take longer in the colder air. Helping her mother grind what little grain they had with a heavy, rotating hand quern, a laborious process that produced only a meager amount of coarse flour. Watching over Kale, keeping him from straying too far or getting underfoot, and learning the names and uses of the wild plants Líadan sought, her small fingers becoming adept at spotting the edible amongst the inedible. Even Kale at 5 might be asked to gather fallen twigs for kindling, or to keep an eye on a wandering chicken, small contributions in a household where every hand, no matter how small, was desperately needed. They would have learned early, as children on farms throughout history always do, that life was work, that survival depended on constant effort. But this was different. This was work, shadowed by a pervasive, chilling fear, by the gnawing uncertainty of whether there would be enough food to see them through the next day, the next week, the next season. The usual childhood games and spontaneous bursts of laughter were more subdued now, often replaced by a watchful quiet, a premature gravity. They would hear the hushed, worried conversations of their parents in the evenings after they were supposedly asleep on their pallets. They would see the strain etched on their faces, the deepening worry lines around their eyes. The world, for Aoife's children, was rapidly becoming a place where the sun was a pale imitation of its former self, where the air was perpetually cold, and where hunger was a constant, unwelcome, and increasingly familiar guest. The weight of the land, its stubborn refusal to yield its accustomed bounty, pressed down not just on the weary shoulders of Aoife and Líadan, but on the small, vulnerable shoulders of their children as well. Their small bellies often rumbled, a sound that tore at Líadan's heart more than any hardship she herself endured. Part 3. Whispers in the Tuath. Aoife's family, though isolated in their daily struggle against the failing elements, did not exist in a vacuum. Their roundhouse, their small farmstead, was part of a larger, intricate social fabric. They belonged to a fine and extended kin group, which formed the very bedrock of early Irish society, a web of blood relations, shared ancestry, and mutual obligations. Several such related families might live in a cluster of raths, their lives and fortunes intertwined by these powerful bonds of kinship, offering a degree of collective security and support in ordinary times. Beyond the fine lay the Tuath, their local territory, a small kingdom perhaps only the size of a modern barony, encompassing several allied kin groups and ruled by a Rí, a chieftain or petty king, to whom they owed allegiance and certain dues. It was within these concentric circles of community that news, however distorted by distance and fear, would filter through, where comfort might occasionally be found, and where inevitably, as the crisis deepened, tensions and conflicts might also arise. When Aoife met with his kinsmen, perhaps at a prearranged gathering, or by chance when seeking scarce resources like firewood or water from a dwindling stream, or when families from their Tuath gathered cautiously at a local assembly point, maybe an ancient ring fort or a prominent standing stone, the talk was inevitably, obsessively, of the strange, persistent weather, the universally failing crops, and the pervasive, suffocating gloom. Voices would be low, hushed, faces etched with worry and a dawning, incredulous fear. Had anyone, even the oldest members of the fine, the repositories of ancestral memory, ever seen a sky like this before? What did the ancient stories, the oral traditions passed down through countless generations say of such times? Were the signs important in the flight of birds, which seemed fewer and quieter, the behavior of animals, which were restless and thin, the very feel of the land, which was cold and unresponsive, being read correctly? Or was this something entirely new, a calamity beyond the scope of all known experience, a true, most dread portent, as Procopius had named it? The chieftain of their Tuath, the Rí, would have been under immense, almost unbearable pressure. His legitimacy, his authority, his very status as leader were, in significant part, tied to the prosperity of his people and the perceived bounty of the land under his stewardship. He was entitled by ancient custom and law to food renders, the best flotha, from his subjects, a share of their grain, their livestock, their dairy produce. But with the widespread catastrophic failure of bread and the decimation of livestock, these dues would be impossible for many, if not most, to pay. How then would he provide for his own extensive household, his retinue of warriors who ensured his power and the defense of the Tuath? What support, if any, could he possibly offer to the most desperate families within his territory, those teetering on the very brink of starvation? The traditional obligations of hospitality, a cornerstone of Irish social life and a mark of a noble and generous leader, became a painful, almost mocking burden when there was little or nothing to share. To turn away a kinsman or a traveler in need was a shameful act, yet to offer what one did not possess was an impossibility. Aoife heard whispers that the Ree's own stores were dwindling, that his face was as grim as any common farmer's. Spiritual leaders, too, would have been anxiously sought for answers, for solace, for some ritual or prayer that might appease whatever angered powers had unleashed this suffering upon them. In 6th century Ireland, older Celtic beliefs, with their reverence for the forces of nature and a pantheon of powerful deities, still held considerable sway, even as the new faith, Christianity, was slowly but surely taking root, spreading from monastic centers. The sun, Angrian, was not merely a celestial body, but a powerful deity, its life-giving warmth and light essential for all existence. The moon, Angelach, governed the tides, the cycles of growth, and the very rhythms of life, its phases carefully observed for planting, harvesting, and other crucial activities. Nature spirits, the Eos Sea or Sid, were believed to inhabit the ancient mounds, the deep forests, the rushing rivers, and the still lakes. Their goodwill, or at least their neutrality, was crucial for a harmonious existence and the fertility of the land. The prolonged, inexplicable dimming of the sun, the erratic and hostile behavior of the seasons, the earth's shocking barrenness, all this would have been profoundly alarming, widely interpreted as undeniable signs of divine anger, of ill omens of the gravest kind, or of a fundamental, terrifying imbalance in the cosmos. Perhaps a local druid, one of the few remaining inheritors of the ancient priestly traditions, or a wise elder, a woman or man versed in the old lore and the complex language of omens, would attempt to divine the cause. Were sacrifices needed, and to whom? Were ancient taboos, long forgotten, now being violated, bringing this retribution upon them? The Christian monks, if a fledgling monastery had been established within reach of Aoife's Tuath, might offer a different, though no less terrifying, interpretation. They might speak of the Christian God's profound displeasure with the sins of mankind, of this being a divine warning, a call to fervent penance, or even a dire portent of apocalyptic times, echoing the fears that were gripping learned men in distant, sophisticated Byzantium. Aoife and Líadan, like many of their contemporaries caught between these shifting spiritual landscapes, might have held a complex mixture of these beliefs, their hearts and minds a battleground of old fears and new doctrines. They might find themselves hedging their spiritual bets, offering prayers to the Christian God for mercy and deliverance, while also being scrupulously careful not to offend the older, perhaps more unpredictable powers of the land, perhaps leaving small offerings of their precious dwindling food at a sacred well or a revered ancient tree, just in case. The fear that permeated their lives was not just of starvation and physical hardship, but of unseen, malevolent forces, of a world suddenly, inexplicably thrown out of joint, its sacred order shattered. Community bonds, the very essence of the fine and the tuath, which were designed to provide a safety net in times of trouble, were being tested to their absolute limits, stretched taut to the point of breaking. In times of ordinary hardship, a localized bad harvest, a cattle raid by a neighboring tuath, kinship ties traditionally ensured that resources were shared, that the vulnerable, the old, the orphaned were cared for. But this crisis was extraordinary, unprecedented in its scale and duration. As food stores dwindled everywhere, as the specter of starvation haunted every household, the primal instinct to protect one's own immediate family, one's own children, would have been overwhelmingly powerful. While some, driven by deep-seated loyalty and compassion, might share their last precious morsels with desperate kin, others, consumed by the raw, visceral fear of starvation, might hoard what little they had, their doors and hearts closing to the pleas of their neighbors. Such actions, understandable in their desperation, would inevitably lead to suspicion, bitter resentment, and perhaps even open violent conflict over the last scraps of food, the last remaining livestock, the last patches of potentially forageable land. Aoife had heard of a dispute between two brothers in a nearby fine over a single scrawny sheep, a dispute that ended with harsh words and drawn knives, something unthinkable in better times. The Brehon laws, the intricate and sophisticated system of customary Irish law that governed almost every aspect of social interaction, from land tenure and inheritance to compensation for injury and the obligations of hospitality, had provisions for many contingencies. But it is unlikely that even these comprehensive laws were designed to cope with a catastrophe of this magnitude, a situation where the very foundations of subsistence had crumbled for everyone, everywhere. How did one enforce the ancient rules of sharing or the sacred duties of hospitality when there was almost nothing left to share? When offering food to another meant taking it directly from the mouths of one's own starving children. The psychological toll of this relentless uncertainty and pervasive fear was immense, a heavy, invisible burden carried by every man, woman, and child. The constant, gnawing hunger, the sight of their children growing thinner, weaker, their laughter fading, the ever-present fear of disease spreading like wildfire through malnourished and weakened bodies, all this weighed heavily, relentlessly on Aoife and Líadan. The world, once a place of familiar challenges and predictable rewards, had become a menacing, alien landscape. The sky, once a source of life-giving light and warmth, now seemed a suffocating, oppressive blanket, a constant reminder of their helplessness. Sleep itself, when it came, might offer little respite, haunted by anxious dreams of empty granaries and crying children. Yet even in the depths of such despair, the human spirit possesses an astonishing, stubborn resilience. There would have been moments, however fleeting, of shared comfort, of human connection that transcended the misery. A story told by Aoife, his voice low and soothing in the firelight, of ancient heroes who faced down monsters and overcame impossible odds. A half-forgotten song hummed by Líadan, a lullaby from her own childhood, as she rocked a fretful, feverish Kale in her arms. The children's brief, quickly suppressed bursts of imaginative play, a reminder of the innocence that even this harsh world could not entirely extinguish. They would cling to the familiar routines, the small, comforting rituals of family life, as anchors in a vast and terrifying sea of uncertainty. Their endurance was not loud or heroic in the manner of the epic tales sung by bards, but a quiet, stubborn, day-by-day refusal to be extinguished, a daily, almost unconscious affirmation of life in the face of overwhelming, incomprehensible odds. Part 4, The Long Twilight, Daily Endurance. As the year 536 AD dragged its weary course across the Irish landscape, the extraordinary, the terrifying, slowly, inexorably became the grim, monotonous ordinary. For Aoife, for Líadan, and for their children, Ronan, Fia, and Kale, life settled into a relentless, exhausting rhythm of quiet, day-by-day endurance. The long twilight of the dimmed sun was no longer a shocking novelty. It was the very fabric of their existence, the oppressive backdrop to every waking moment, shaping their struggles, their fears, their conversations, and their dwindling, carefully hoarded hopes. The world felt perpetually stuck in a dreary, sunless afternoon. Their diet, once simple but generally sustaining, a balance of grains, dairy, some meat, and foraged foods, became a desperate, daily, all-consuming quest for anything that might stave off the worst pangs of hunger. The failure of bread, so starkly noted in the annals, meant that the staple grains, the oats and barley that formed the bulk of their calories, were largely absent. What little remained from previous better years, perhaps stored in pottery jars or leather bags in a corner of the roundhouse, was rationed with an agonizing, almost religious care. Each day, Líadan would measure out a tiny portion, to be ground with immense effort on the heavy hand quern into a coarse, gritty flour, enough for a thin, watery gruel, or a few small, precious bannocks cooked on a hot stone by the fire. Dairy products, another cornerstone of their traditional foodways, dwindled to almost nothing as their single cow, weakened by poor grazing and the constant chill, produced less and less milk. Fresh milk became a distant memory, reserved only for the youngest or the sickest. Butter, once churned regularly, was an unimaginable luxury. Meat was even rarer. Any animal slaughtered, whether one of their own precious few or a lucky catch from hunting, was a sign of extreme, desperate need, as it meant sacrificing future sustenance, future breeding stock, for immediate survival. The taste of meat became a fading memory, replaced by the blandness of boiled roots and bitter greens. Líadan's foraging expeditions, often accompanied by a watchful and increasingly knowledgeable Fia, became ever more critical to their survival and simultaneously ever more challenging and less rewarding. They scoured the landscape, the skeletal woodlands, the damp, unforgiving bogs, the barren hedgerows, for anything the harsh, unnatural conditions had spared. They dug for tough, fibrous roots that required hours of boiling to become even remotely palatable. They searched for the few hardy nuts or berries that might have managed to ripen in the gloom, their flavor often bitter or insipid. They gathered any edible greens that pushed their way through the cold soil, leaves that in better times might have been ignored or fed to the pigs. If their homestead was within a day's arduous walk of the coast, they might undertake the journey in the desperate hope of finding shellfish clinging to the rocks at low tide, or edible seaweeds washed ashore by the restless waves. Every edible scrap, no matter how meager or unappetizing, was a small, hard-won victory against the pervasive, gnawing hunger that was now their constant, unwelcome companion. She taught Fia to identify plants by the faintest scent or the texture of a leaf in the poor light, skills that might mean the difference between a small meal and an empty belly. The children, too, their senses sharpened by hunger, would have been constantly on the lookout for any potential food source. Ronan, with a boy's boundless, if often misplaced optimism, might try his hand at snaring small birds or rabbits with crude homemade traps, though the wildlife too would have been affected by the widespread environmental changes, becoming scarcer and warier. More often than not, he returned empty-handed, his face etched with a frustration that mirrored his father's. Their roundhouse, the traditional circular dwelling that was the center of their world, offered shelter from the worst of the elements, but little true comfort in these trying times. The wattle and daub walls, perhaps with a low stone foundation to deter damp and vermin, did their best to keep out the wind and the rain, but the persistent, penetrating dampness of the Irish climate, greatly exacerbated by the lack of drying sun, seemed to seep into everything: their clothes, their bedding, the very structure of the house itself. A musty odor clung to the air, no matter how diligently Líadan tried to air the dwelling during the brief, weak spells of daylight. The conical thatched roof, if not perfectly maintained with fresh layers of reed or straw, might develop leaks during the frequent chilling rains, adding to the misery. The central hearth, a shallow, clay-lined pit, was the undisputed heart of the home, its smoky peat fire rarely allowed to die out completely, day or night. It provided a meager, localized warmth and the only means of cooking their scanty meals, but it also filled the single, circular room with an acrid, eye-stinging smoke that irritated their lungs and coated the soot-blackened rafters above with a thick, greasy film. Light, especially during the long, gloomy days, was a precious, scarce commodity. The weak, watery daylight struggled to penetrate the single low doorway or the small, intentionally restricted smoke hole in the apex of the roof. Evenings, which now seemed to begin in the mid-afternoon, were spent in the flickering, uncertain glow of the fire, or perhaps on rare occasions by the even dimmer, sputtering light of a tallow dip, a wick set in a small dish of precious animal fat, if they could spare such a valuable resource. Sleeping arrangements remained simple and communal. Pallets of straw or dried bracken laid directly on the packed earthen floor, perhaps in a designated area of the roundhouse, though clear internal divisions were not always a feature of such dwellings. The entire family, Aoife, Líadan, Ronan, Fia, and Cale, would huddle together for warmth against the pervasive, bone-aching chill that even the fire could not fully dispel. Their dreams were often of sunshine and full bellies, a stark contrast to their waking reality. Daily chores, the mundane tasks that underpin all human existence, became a testament to their quiet, stubborn resilience, a constant, wearying battle against encroaching scarcity and despair. For Aoife and Ronan, there was always work to be done, even if the rewards were heartbreakingly small, almost invisible. Tending the near barren fields, weeding the struggling, pathetic crops, hoping against all rational hope for some small, miraculous yield. Caring for the weakened, hungry livestock, searching further and further afield for any scrap of fodder, withered grass, fallen leaves, even branches that could be stripped of their bark. Repairing the simple wooden fences of their wrath, the protective enclosure around their homestead, or patching the wattle walls of the house where the daub had cracked or fallen away, using basic tools like axes and adzes. Gathering fuel was a constant, time-consuming necessity. Cutting and laboriously drying peat from the local bog if they had rights to one, a back-breaking task, or scavenging for firewood in the depleted woodlands, wood that was often damp and smoky, and which seemed to burn faster and faster in the constant, desperate effort to keep the chill at bay. Líadan's days were equally, if differently, consumed by relentless effort. Grinding what little grain they possessed with the heavy, cumbersome rotary quernstones was physically exhausting work, often taking hours to produce only a meager amount of coarse, gritty flour. Preparing their scanty meals, a constant exercise in ingenuity and frustration, trying to stretch insufficient ingredients to feed 5 hungry, increasingly desperate bodies. Mending their coarse woolen clothing, tunics, cloaks, simple leg coverings, with needles crafted from bone or antler and thread spun from their own sheep's meager wool, patching patches until the original fabric was barely discernible beneath the layers of repair. Keeping the children clean and as healthy as possible in such challenging, often unhygienic conditions was a constant, underlying worry. Fetching water in a wooden bucket or a pottery jar from the nearby stream or well, a task often shared by Fia, was a daily necessity, regardless of the weather. The tools they used were simple, functional, and hard-won, often passed down through generations, or crafted by a local smith or woodworker in better times. The yard plow, spades, perhaps a local variant of the one-footed spade, the loy, made by a skilled blacksmith, sickles for harvesting, though there was precious little to harvest now, axes for felling timber and chopping wood, and knives for a multitude of tasks were essential for the farm. Líadan would have her cooking pots, perhaps of simple, unglazed pottery, or even of stitched leather for boiling liquids, wooden bowls and spoons, carved by Aoife in the longer evenings of previous winters, and her spindle and whorl for spinning wool into yarn, if the sheep yielded any fleece worth the effort. These items were treasured, carefully maintained, and repaired when broken, for replacing them in these straitened times was often an impossibility. A broken tool was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to their survival. Food preservation techniques, the ancient knowledge honed over countless generations, were their only fragile defense against immediate starvation and the looming threat of the long, dark winter ahead. Salting, if salt could be obtained through trade or from coastal evaporation pans, was the primary method for preserving any meat they might acquire, the salt drawing out moisture and inhibiting the growth of spoilage-causing bacteria. Fermentation, a process often driven by naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria, could transform milk into longer-lasting, more digestible products like yogurt, clabber, or simple, soured milk cheeses. Some vegetables, if they had any surplus, might also be preserved through lactic acid fermentation, enhancing their nutritional value and extending their edibility. Drying herbs or any foraged greens in the smoky, relatively dry air near the rafters of the roundhouse might extend their use into the leaner months. Every method employed, every scrap of food saved from decay, was a small, defiant act of hope against the relentless decay and overwhelming scarcity that threatened to engulf them. The psychological burden of this long, seemingly endless twilight was immense, a heavy, invisible cloak that settled upon their spirits. The constant, gnawing anxiety about food, the ever-present fear of illness striking their malnourished children, as malnutrition made them acutely vulnerable to every passing sickness, every infection. The quiet, unspoken grief of watching their familiar, beloved world wither and fade before their eyes. There would have been moments of profound, quiet despair, of a weariness so deep and pervasive it felt like a physical weight pressing down on their chests, making each breath an effort. Yet, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit is not built for unending despair. There would also have been moments, however fleeting and fragile, of shared humanity, of connection that transcended the misery. A story told by Aoife, his voice low and soothing in the firelight, of ancient heroes who faced down monsters and overcame impossible odds. A half-forgotten song hummed by Líadan, a lullaby from her own childhood as she rocked a fretful, feverish Kale in her arms. The children's brief, quickly suppressed bursts of imaginative play, a reminder of the innocence that even this harsh world could not entirely extinguish. They would cling to the familiar routines, the small, comforting rituals of family life, as anchors in a vast and terrifying sea of uncertainty. Their endurance was not loud or heroic in the manner of the epic tales sung by bards, but a quiet, stubborn, day-by-day refusal to be extinguished, a daily, almost unconscious affirmation of life in the face of overwhelming, incomprehensible odds. Part 5. The Turning of a Dark Year. The seasons of 536 AD, as the Roman statesman Cassiodorus, far away in Italy, lamented with eloquent despair, seemed all jumbled up together, their familiar, life-sustaining cadence lost in a chaotic, chilling dissonance. For Aoife and his family, struggling for survival in their small corner of the Irish landscape, the year unfolded not with its accustomed rhythm of growth, bounty, and rest, but as a slow, agonizing, and seemingly endless descent into deeper and more profound hardship. Each sunrise brought not hope, but a renewed awareness of the weak in different light. The spring, which should have arrived with the vibrant songs of returning birds, the bursting of green buds, and the quickening pulse of life in the warming earth, had been a cruel, protracted deception. Its promise of renewal, of fresh beginnings, had been choked and stifled by the persistent, biting cold and the veiled, impotent sun. Planting their precious, dwindling stocks of barley and oat seed had been an act of desperate faith, a ritual performed more out of ingrained habit and a refusal to surrender than any real expectation of reward. And that faith, by and large, had gone unrewarded. The earth itself felt cold and dead beneath their feet, unresponsive to their efforts. Summer, the season that should have brought long, sun-drenched days, the gentle warmth needed for ripening fields, and the joyful hum of insects, was instead a period of bleak, dim, and unnervingly cool days. The sun, when it was visible at all through the dense, dry fog that often clung to the land until midday or beyond, offered little heat, its rays feeling weak and watery on their skin. Aoife would have walked through his struggling fields of barley and oats with a heart heavy as a millstone, seeing the stunted, sickly growth, the pale, underdeveloped stalks, the near-empty heads of grain that promised little more than chaff and bitter disappointment. The vibrant chorus of birdsong, the busy drone of bees, the myriad small sounds that usually filled the summer air, all seemed muted, subdued, as if nature itself was holding its breath, caught in a state of suspended animation, or perhaps of mourning. The usual joy of summer, the feeling of abundance and life, was replaced by a chilling emptiness. Autumn, the season of harvest, traditionally a time of communal effort, of satisfaction in the gathering of the earth's bounty, of preparation for the coming winter, arrived not with the golden hues of ripe grain and the cheerful bustle of reaping and threshing, but with a grim, stark, and unavoidable reckoning. The failure of bread was now absolute, undeniable. The meager, pathetic yield from their fields was a pittance, barely enough, perhaps, to provide a handful of seed for the next desperate, almost hopeless planting, let alone to sustain them through the long, dark, and inevitably hungry months of winter. Foraging, which had been a supplementary activity, became their primary, all-consuming focus, as families, gaunt and hollow-eyed, scoured the depleted countryside for the last of the season's nuts and berries, digging with renewed desperation for any edible roots in the rapidly hardening ground. The air, which should have been crisp and invigorating, held a sharper, more menacing chill, a chilling foretaste of the winter that loomed ahead, a winter they faced with terrifyingly depleted stores and even more depleted spirits. The vibrant colors of autumn leaves were dulled, the season's beauty overshadowed by the pervasive sense of dread. As winter tightened its icy, unforgiving grip on the land, life in the small, smoky roundhouse became even more challenging, more precarious. The days, already unnaturally short due to the dimmed sun, shrank further, the weak, reluctant sun offering only a few precious hours of gray, insufficient light before surrendering to the long, oppressive darkness. The nights were immensely long, bitterly cold, and filled with the unsettling sounds of the wind moaning like a hungry wolf outside their flimsy walls, and the anxious, shallow, quiet breathing of the family huddled together within. Fuel for the peat fire became their most precious commodity, the daily exhausting gathering of it an absolute, non-negotiable necessity for survival. Huddled around the smoky, flickering hearth, wrapped in their threadbare woolen cloaks, Aoife's family would try to conserve every scrap of warmth, every calorie of energy. Stories might be told in hushed voices, ancient tales of heroes and magic, of gods and monsters, perhaps offering a fleeting, momentary escape from their grim, unrelenting reality. Or they might sit for long periods in a companionable, weary silence, the only sounds the crackle and hiss of the fire, the sigh of the wind, and the insistent, painful gnawing in their empty bellies. The cold seemed to seep into their very bones, a constant, aching presence. This was not, they were slowly, terrifyingly beginning to realize, just a single, exceptionally bad year, an anomaly that would pass with the turning of the seasons. The scientific understanding now is that the cataclysmic volcanic eruptions of 536 AD and the years immediately following marked the true beginning of what climatologists call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, Alia, a period of sustained, significant cooling that would grip many parts of the Northern Hemisphere for over a century, in some regions persisting until around 660 AD or even later. Those born after this dreadful year, children like Aoife's youngest, Kale, or those yet to be conceived in these dark times, would know only this cooler, dimmer, more precarious and uncertain world as their baseline reality. The memory of a brighter, warmer, more generous past would gradually fade with the passing of the older generation, becoming little more than legend, a half-believed fireside tale of a lost golden age. For Aoife, for Líadan, for Ronan, Fia, and little Kale, there was no neat resolution, no comforting closure as the year 536 finally, tortuously, drew to its somber, shadowed close. There was no sudden, miraculous return of the sun's strength, no magical replenishment of their empty food stores, no divine intervention to lift the crushing weight of their suffering. Their story for this worst year to be alive ends as it was lived, in quiet, desperate, day-by-day endurance, in the relentless, grinding struggle for survival, in the small, fragile, flickering flame of hope and human connection that, against all odds, refused to be entirely extinguished by the overwhelming, encroaching darkness. They faced the uncertain, chill dawn of 537 AD with the same grim, weary determination, the same deep, unspoken love for one another that had somehow carried them through the worst year. Their lives a quiet, unheralded testament to the astonishing resilience of ordinary people caught in the unforgiving sweep of extraordinary world-altering events. Their faces were thinner. Their eyes held a new, old wisdom born of hardship, but they were still together. And in that, perhaps, lay the faintest glimmer of a future. And so, by the flickering light of our candle, we have glimpsed into the shadowed world of Aoife and his family. Ordinary souls navigating an age of profound, almost unimaginable crisis. Their struggles in 6th century Ireland, under a sky that had lost its brilliance and a land that had lost its bounty, remind us of the inherent fragility of human existence, so often dependent on the delicate, easily disrupted balance of nature. Yet in their story, in their quiet perseverance, we also find a profound and enduring power, the power of resilience, of adaptation, of the unbreakable bonds of family and community, however strained. The worst year to be alive was undoubtedly a time of immense, widespread suffering, a period when despair must have seemed an ever-present companion. But it was also a time when the quiet dignity of human endurance, the stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness, shone through the gloom with a faint but steady light. Thank you for joining us at the Candlelight Historian for this first chapter in our exploration of 536 AD. We hope this journey into the past has offered a moment of reflection, a gentle space to consider the echoes of lives lived long ago, lives that, despite the vast gulf of time, share in our common humanity. Until next time, when we will travel to another corner of this afflicted world, may your own hearth be warm, your spirits find peace, and your skies be bright.